One of my favorite things about being in the church is that there are so many different kinds of people of all different ages. Visiting with older people, sitting down and talking with them has a lot of benefit to it because they have a lot of stories, they have a lot of knowledge and advice they can give to us, and it seems like maybe we live in a day and age where we don't really value what the older generation can provide and give to us. It seems a lot of times if older members are sped past on the parkway or on the road, or they're kind of tossed to the side, or they're not seen as people that can provide or give very much to the church today. That's not really true, especially for older members that have grown up in the church or have this deep and meaningful relationship with God. They can give us so much that can help us in our own personal spiritual lives. A couple of sayings that the older generation have given us that are very useful are, act like you'll need your body in 100 years. Or, being old is fun, you can do whatever you want. That was from Ken Taylor, a member here at the Farley Church of Christ. Don't sweat the small stuff. And then one from an older member who'd been married for 50 years in Jacksonville Church of Christ said, the key to winning an argument every time is getting in the last word, and that is yes, ma'am. Make the most of less. But not all older people will give the best advice in the world. I talked to an older gentleman a while back who said that we all die anyway, so nothing really matters. And that's not true. When you look at the book of Ecclesiastes, it's written by a man who spent his entire life going on a quest, and that quest was to find out what the purpose of life really was. Solomon is one of those men that you can read about, and you can read his sayings and his experiences in the book of Ecclesiastes, and you can know for sure that the advice that he's giving and the things that he's talking about are 100% accurate because he was, in fact, inspired by God. As wise as the older members of your congregation might be, or your grandparents, or an older person that you look up to might be, he's not inspired or she's not inspired by God. Ecclesiastes is a very valuable book to go to because it teaches us what our purpose is, what the point of life is. It's 12 chapters that are a great source for us to dive into and to apply to our own lives so that we can understand the world around us just a little bit better. Solomon was a man of great wealth, and of course we know that his knowledge and his wisdom came from God, but God also blessed him with lots of riches and lots of land and lots of victories, and so he uses all of these resources that he has to put on this great life experiment, if you will. He decides, well, maybe the source of happiness in life, the point, the purpose of life is to gather as much riches and wealth as I possibly can. Or maybe it's to marry as many women as I can, find fulfillment in love, or maybe it's family. And so he goes through all of these different experiments, and of course if you've read the book of Ecclesiastes, by the time you get to chapter 12, he's like looking back on his entire life, and he says, the end of the matter is this, fear God. Fear God. That's what his conclusion was after all of these experiments. And I want to break down the book of Ecclesiastes for you. So if you have your Bible, I'd like for you to open that up and just turn to this book. And I'll give you a very short outline of the book and a quick overview of it. And then we'll draw some application from the major points that Solomon will bring up in these 12 chapters. It starts off with a search for purpose. So as you read down through this book, he opens up the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem, which we know to be Solomon. And he starts in verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanities of vanities, all is vanity. Some people look at the book of Ecclesiastes like it's a very dark book. It's a gloomy book. And so maybe for that reason, some people choose to avoid this book in the wisdom literature genre. But it's not. If you look at it, yes, Solomon is saying that all of these different aspects of life are vanity, but there's a key phrase that he uses and that he will continue to use. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But this search for purpose continues through chapter 2, verse 26. So that's verse 4 through 2, 26. It's a search for purpose. Solomon opens up by basically introducing to us what his plan is. His plan is to find out what life is all about. Now you would think, especially living in America, you would think in our society that we have it figured out. It's the American dream. The purpose to life is to gather as much wealth as you possibly can. It's to be financially stable. It's to pursue anything that makes you happy. They say that if you love your job, you never work a day in your life. And we hear things like this, and sometimes we take those things and we adopt them into our own minds, into our own thinking, and we find out from the book of Ecclesiastes that that's not really the point. That's not really the purpose. And so he will continue to use these words, vanity, vanity, vanity. But then from there, he'll switch in chapter 3 to observations about life. That's chapter 3, verse 1, and that goes through chapter 6, ending in verse 12. Observations from life. So he goes on a search for purpose. And then in chapter 3, he switches and starts just taking a look around at life. And so Solomon, I picture him sitting back on his throne or in his chair, and he's sitting back and he's just making observations about his kingdom, about his life. And he goes through in those 3 chapters and just points out all these different aspects about, is it family? Is it wealth? Is it love? And he just points out all of these different observations, and that ends in chapter 6 and verse 12. And then he switches from that to wise counsel for life. And that's in chapter 7, and that goes all the way through chapter 12 and verse 7. It's wise counsel for life. So as you read through this book, if you don't make it to chapter 7, it does seem to be a very discouraging book. It seems to be that Solomon has adopted this attitude of all is doom and gloom until you get to chapter 7. And that's when he starts using that wisdom that God has given him to sort out all of these different things. And Solomon is one that was able to carry out all of these experiments, so it relates to literally everybody. So he switches to counsel for life in verse 12. The key words to this book, you can probably guess what the first one would be. That's the word vanity. This word is used 35 times in just 29 verses, vanity. And that word there is not really one that we use a lot in our everyday conversations, but the word just means futile. It means useless. It means nothing. It's nothingness. And so if you switch that word out and switch vanity out with one of that words like futile or useless, he basically starts off in verse 2 saying, useless of uselessness, says the preacher. Useless of uselessness. All is useless. Now that's a very depressing way to look at life. If someone walked in or someone walked into the room and said, everything in life is useless and there's no point, it's pointless, that person would probably bring down everybody else in that room. But Solomon is making a point, and it's actually a very ingenious way of beginning this writing because it captures your attention. You would think, getting into verse 3, what do you mean by everything is useless? And maybe there are some things that begin to spin around in your mind, like what about my family? Or what about my friends? Or what about nature? What about hunting or fishing? And you begin to think, what are those things useless? Because I find a lot of joy in those things. Or I love this certain aspect about my life a lot. I love my car, or I love my dog. Is everything really useless? So Solomon uses that to capture our attention and to unveil some very profound truths here. But he says vanity 35 times. And it's talking about this earthly existence. Vanity is the earthly existence. That's in chapter 3, 19 through 21. Our earthly existence, it's useless. And then he says, our gathering of wealth in chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. That gathering of wealth, it's useless. Now that describes the majority of the world, especially in America, the gathering of wealth. Right? That's why a lot of people wake up in the morning in the first place. They're going to go to work to gather more wealth. The whole point of maybe some young entrepreneurs are, my dream is to become wealthy, and then my life will be better. If I can gather as much wealth as I possibly can, I will have no more problems. So Solomon covers that topic in chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. The gathering of wealth. That search for money and for riches. And this is coming from a person who has a lot. This is not a poor, jealous individual who can't achieve that and saying, gathering wealth and riches is pointless because he knows that he'll never achieve that. Now this is coming from a very rich and powerful king who has everything that he could possibly want and more. And he says, all this gathering of wealth. everything that I have. And again, I imagine him sitting in his palace, and he built those hanging gardens in Babylon. I imagine him looking at this, or looking off of his balcony, seeing all of his wealth, all of his servants, all of his animals, and saying, this is useless. This is all vanity. This is all futile. And then he says popularity, specifically political popularity. In chapter 4 and verse 16, it's useless. So if it's not wealth, and a lot of people want both. They want wealth and they want popularity. But he specifically uses political popularity, but we can use that in any form of that word, popularity. Basically what Solomon is saying is, your Instagram followers don't matter. How many friends you have on Facebook, how many likes you get on Facebook, it doesn't matter. How popular you are. If your goal in life is to become famous, to make a name for yourself, to make a large impact in that way because you want people to know your name, Solomon says it's useless. It's futile. There's no point to it all. And then he says your dreams. In chapter 5, verse 7, he talks about our dreams. Those things that we think about that we want. Now, I have a dream to have a cabin on some land. That has been my dream for a very long time. And I think about that dream a lot. And I think about, how can I make this happen? How can I build a cabin? How can I acquire some land? How can I have my little safe place on a plot of land in the middle of nowhere? That's my dream. Now, you can insert your own dream there when you get into chapter 5. Your dreams. What is it that you want? What is something that you don't have that you think about a lot because you do want it? Well, Solomon says, your dreams are futile. They're pointless. I mentioned those hanging gardens in Babylon, but you can read about all of the gardens and the buildings and the things that Solomon did in his life. And those began as dreams, but the difference between Solomon and many of us are, no matter how big those dreams were, Solomon was able to make them happen. So Solomon, again, is telling us in his old age, look, you may have this idea in your mind about something that you want, a dream that you have, but even if you achieve that dream, even if you reach that goal, it's pointless. It's useless. And Solomon does reach all of his goals, and he does accomplish all of those things, and he's still able to say, that was pointless. I spent so much of my life building this or planning this, and when it happened, there was no point to it. So Solomon moves down and he talks about luxury, very similar to wealth, but this is in chapter 5. He talks about luxury, all the luxuries of life. I want to live in a place that always has AC. I want to live in a place that has the biggest TV. I want to be as comfortable as I possibly can. And Solomon says that's pointless too. And Solomon was one that lived in extreme luxury. I mean, in an abundance of luxury. He had everything he could possibly want, and he still said that lifestyle, completely pointless. And then he talks about wealth without God. So you can see him start to shift gears a little bit as we work our way through Ecclesiastes. Wealth without God. This is in chapter 6 and verse 2. Wealth without God is vanity. And this is when you can begin to see the major point that Solomon is trying to make. He's not trying to depress everyone. He's not trying to bring everyone down by saying, all of those dreams you have, all the desires of your heart, everything that you think has value to it, it's useless. He switches that train of thought by saying, wealth without God is pointless. And then he says in chapter 6, the same chapter in verse 9, he says, wandering desires are futile. They're pointless. Wandering desire. Maybe that's not the way that we would phrase it, but let me put it this way. You may have heard it said, whatever makes you happy, do it. If it makes you happy, if it makes you feel good, then that is what's right in this life. And people look at even religion that way. If it matches how you think, if it fits how you feel or how you would like this life to be or how to live, then just do that. Just go to that church. Just join that religion. But it branches out even more than that, into relationships. It's okay. You can love anybody, and really in this day and age, anything, if it makes you feel good. If that is what your wandering desire is what Solomon is trying to say. If that's what it is, then that's what will make you happy. And again, Solomon says, those wandering desires that you have, they're futile. They're pointless. And then he says in chapter 7, foolish laughter. Foolish laughter is vanity. Makes you laugh, you're having a great time, and you think that life is going great. It's going to end, and so it's futile, and it's useless. Then he talks about injustice in life in chapter 8 and verse 14. Injustice in life. Again, it's phrased a little bit strange, but what about that person that cuts you off in traffic? What about that person that irritates you in the workplace and you can't stop thinking about it? You can't stop thinking about that one annoying person or that one remark that someone said to you that made you feel bad. Or maybe someone in the Walmart parking lot walks by your car, pulls out a key, and scratches your car all the way down. That makes us angry. It makes us irritated. And sometimes we fly off the handle. And we get so angry at the injustice that we see in the world around us. And of course, they get a lot bigger than just keying your car or someone cutting you off in traffic or saying something mean to you. We don't have to look very far at all to see injustice in this world. Even inside the church, we see injustice. Brothers and sisters treat each other wrongly. They do things to each other that are they're sinful and they're mean. And so we get worked up about these things. And we get worked up about things that we really have no control over besides how we react to them. So he says, it's vanity. Injustice in life, it's vanity. And I think you can probably see his point as he begins to change this thought process, because we have no control over that. I don't have control over how someone treats me. I don't have control over if I'm in the store shopping and someone outside keys my car. It's done. It's happened. But Solomon's point is, there is a judge. There is someone more powerful. There is someone that's watching. And in the end, everyone is going to meet that judge. So the injustice that we see in our world around, it's not our job to become nighttime vigilantes and go out and try and take justice into our own hands. It's just not our job. So Solomon says, all that, let it go. You can't throw rocks at every dog that barks. Wandering desire, foolish laughter, injustice in life. And then he says, the days of darkness. Days of darkness, kind of building upon that idea in chapter 11, verse 8. It's very interesting to me that Solomon would bring this up in his day, in his time, especially when his reign and everything seemed to be going great. I mean, what possible darkness could there be in Solomon's life? What days of darkness? His life is amazing, but the fact is, whatever time period you live in will be days of darkness, because we live in a fallen world. Ever since the book of Genesis tells us that man fell and then sin entered into the world, and everything kind of went downhill from there. And of course we have that saving grace, that light, and that hope that we have in Jesus. But Solomon brings up the point of living in dark days. And we can look around the world again today and say, these are dark days. These are days of darkness. There's war. There's these twisted political powers. There are this coronavirus that's going on. There are all these different things that we can point to and say, we are living in days of darkness. Solomon again says, it's vanity. It's useless. Every generation is going to have that. Every generation is going to face days of darkness. And it's pointless and it's useless. And then he says, lastly, in chapter 11, verse 10, youth. I began talking about how older people have given us some very good advice. Some of them maybe not given us the best advice in the world. But our nation especially worships the youth. They worship youthfulness. Try and look as young as you can using this makeup product. Try and look as young as you can dressing like this. Try and be as young as you can by continuing on in youthful activities even in your older age. We might call it a midlife crisis. Youth. It's vanity. And Solomon will talk about how you don't stay young forever. Eventually your body will break down. You can see that again in Romans chapter 8. The world spins and we break down and the world breaks down. Everything is running down. And again, that sounds depressing. And so Solomon is saying, no matter what you accomplish in this life, no matter what your dreams are, no matter what you care about, it's all pointless. But he adds on to it, the key phrase to understanding this entire book is under the sun. 3 words that unlock this entire book. Under the sun. It's vanity, it's useless, there's no meaning to it under the sun, on this earth, without God. Without God, everything has no point. And then he uses two more words in chapter 12, verse 11. Goads and nails. Goads and nails. These are wise sayings to provoke us to think. That's what Solomon is trying to get us to do the entire book. We're waiting for his point almost as you read through each chapter. Okay, we understand this is useless, this is pointless. So what is the point in life? What is our purpose? And Solomon even backtracks a little bit by saying, no, I'm not saying your family is pointless. I'm not saying your wealth is pointless. I'm not saying your dreams are pointless, but if you have dreams that don't involve God, those are pointless. If you are living life without God, those are pointless. If you have a relationship that you love and that you care about, but God's not involved in that relationship, that's vanity. That's pointless. That's useless. And that's short-sighted. Because it's only under the sun. You only enjoy those things under the sun. And then after we get out from underneath the sun, if you will, as we transition into that spiritual world, all that's gone. You don't take anything with you. I don't know if you've read about or seen too much about the Egyptian tombs and these giant pyramids, but a lot of the pharaohs had this mindset of, I want to be buried with my servants. I want to be buried with all of my wealth because these are the things that I need to take with me into the afterlife. Well, Solomon had it figured out. He's saying all of these things, all of your accomplishments and all this wealth that you've gathered, if you don't have God in your life, that is pointless because you can't take any of that stuff with you. But if you just take God and you mix him in with all of these things, you sprinkle them in with all of the things that Paul or that Solomon is talking about, you see the value in them. For instance, political popularity or popularity. If you are a popular individual, but you are a God-fearing person, what an impact you can make with that. That's not vanity. That's not useless because you are using that platform for good. And you can take that into the afterlife. Or what about this gathering of wealth? You have all of this money, add some God to that, add God into your life, then you can use that wealth for some good. Or what about the injustices in life? Add some God to that. Look at everything through God's eyes, all of a sudden that doesn't matter anymore. Someone keys your car, well that car's burning up in the end. I'm not taking that car with me. Someone cuts you off in traffic, that's a person, that's a soul, because that's how God sees that person. Anything that's happening in our world that we see as to be an injustice of some kind, we know that in the end, God is the ultimate judge. And with God in our lives, he adds meaning. It's no longer vanity, it's no longer futile, it's no longer useless because God made it that way. It's very profound when you look at life with and without God. Life with God is long-term thinking. Life without God is very short-sighted. Solomon will bring up a few things in this book, especially in chapter 2 and chapter 3. He says some things that maybe will make us turn our head a little bit. He says, who can know where the Spirit goes? Who can say, really, that when an animal dies, it goes into the ground, and when a person dies, it goes back to God? Who can say that? And so we begin to think, is this the Bible I'm reading here? Because isn't the whole Bible and the point, especially coming from Solomon, isn't it that we are going to die one day? And that we are going to go somewhere? And yet Solomon is still saying, we can't know. Who knows? But as he works his way through this big experiment, keep in mind, he says several times throughout these chapters, but I clung on to wisdom. He was seeking. He was looking for something. He was navigating his way through life, being led by God. He hung on to that wisdom. And when you get into chapter 12, when you get into this last chapter and Solomon wraps everything up, the rest of the book makes sense. I would say that Ecclesiastes is probably not one of those books that if you haven't read the whole thing, that you should just sit down and work your way through one chapter. Because without looking at the bigger picture, it really is not a very uplifting book to read. But he starts off in chapter 12, remember your Creator in your youth. Your youthfulness that you worship so much being young, remember your Creator in your youth. And that's how you can create a platform. This is a message for parents. As you raise your kids, help them to remember their Creator. And one of the best ways that you can do that is show them. Show them what God can do in your life, what God can do in their life. Read with them, study with them, help them grow and mature in their relationship so that they don't have to make all of those mistakes that so many people have done in order to figure out that that was the wrong way to live. Remember your Creator in your youth. And then starting in verse 9 is that section that we love so much in Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep his commandments. The end of the matter, after all has been heard, fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil. That's the message of the Bible. That's not just the entire point of Ecclesiastes. That's the entire point of the Bible. You get into Revelation chapter 20 and verse 12, it says, they saw the dead, the small, and the great standing before God, and a book was opened, and another book was opened, which was the book of life, and the dead were judged out of the things which were written according to their works, whether good or evil. This wisdom is clearly from God because it's very unified with the rest of the message of the Bible. Solomon does not say one thing in this book that contradicts the rest of the big picture of the Bible. And that's still the end of the matter. Fear God. The duty of man, the duty of mankind, is to fear God and to keep his commandments. Because all the deeds that we are doing throughout our day-to-day life, they're being recorded. They're being written down. Are those things good? Are those things evil? Are the things that you're pursuing, are the things that you're involved in, is God involved in them too? The things that you're pursuing, is God a part of that? Why do you want to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish? That's a good question to ask to find out where your heart is. Do I want my cabin in the woods way away from everywhere so I can just avoid life and not interact with anybody, to escape everything? It's a good question to ask. Why do I want that so bad? Why do you want something so bad? If God is nowhere in that mix, nowhere in that plan, then perhaps that's something that Solomon is trying to help you see in your own life. While it may look like the book of Ecclesiastes is all doom and gloom, we see a very hopeful and beautiful message once you get to the conclusion. I hope that you found this lesson valuable, and I hope that it was a good use of your time. And I'd like to encourage you, as we broke down this book, to go and look at those individual chapters. If there's something that stuck out to you as something you struggled with, wealth, desire, whatever, and look at those specific chapters and look at what Solomon has to say about those specific things and see if it doesn't help you sort that out and to fear God more and to serve God better tomorrow and the rest of the day than you did yesterday.